In July 1985, a 29-year-old seemed hopeful when she told friends she was leaving her abusive husband. By the next day, she had vanished. Her husband claimed she stormed out of their apartment after an argument. What followed was a decades-long investigation filled with disturbing allegations, a suspicious flight over open water, and a final confession that confirmed everyone's worst fears. Welcome to Without a Trace. I'm your host, Jalen. Every file holds a mystery. Every story deserves to be heard. This is Gail's story. Gail was born on March 8, 1956 in Brooklyn, New York. She was the youngest of 3 children born to Manny and Sylvia Katz. Her childhood wasn't the easiest. The family seemed to be under constant financial stress due to Manny's business ventures. It wasn't an easy environment for anyone in the family, but Gail took it the hardest. She was described as being sensitive and anxious. Her parents constantly fought with each other about how to handle her low self-esteem and emotional outbursts. They fought with her about what her parents described as her long string of messy relationships. Most of the guys she dated had their own baggage. Her parents referred to them as Gail's reformation projects. It seemed like Gail was trying to fix the guys she dated to keep her mind off her own problems. She struggled with depression, especially during college. She turned to cocaine and dropped out of college twice. In 1979, when she was 23 years old, Gail went through a really bad breakup and tried to take her own life. Thankfully, a friend arrived at her apartment just in time. After this, things seemed to get worse for Gail. Her mother believed the solution to her problems was to stop dating the guys that needed fixing and instead find someone like a nice doctor. Eventually, Gail did just that. In 1981, mutual friends set Gail up with Robert Bierenbaum, who seemed like the perfect catch. At the time, she was in college and working odd jobs. He was a surgical resident with plans of becoming a plastic surgeon. From the beginning, Robert was infatuated with Gail, and he did everything he could to impress her. He rented planes by the hour for his dates with her. One of their very first dates was flying around New York City as the sun was setting. But the feelings weren't mutual for Gail. There were a few things about Robert that bothered Gail, like the fact that he overreacted about tiny circumstances or that his appearance was known to be a bit disheveled. Plus, he was a conservative and she was a liberal, so the two could never really agree on things. However, it wasn't hard for Gail to see the potential. Robert came from a wealthy family and had a well-paying job. He was handsome, and he had a passion for gourmet cooking, skiing, and piloting small planes. So Gail was able to overlook the things that bothered her, and when Robert proposed, less than a year into their relationship, she said yes. They married in August of 1982. After returning from their honeymoon, Gail returned to college, receiving a bachelor's degree in psychology. She went on to receive her doctorate in clinical psychology. She began seeing her own patients and created a business on the side where she ran errands for wealthy clients between counseling sessions. She and Robert were both busy with their careers, but they seemed to make it work. That is, however, until about 3 years into their relationship. On Saturday, July 6, 1985, Gail met up with her friend Denise at a New York City hair salon. She was carrying a newspaper that was open to the classifieds, where she had circled a couple of the listings. Gail surprised her friend by telling her she was leaving her husband that weekend. She told her friend that she would force Robert to not only agree to divorce, but also to her preferred terms for settlement. Gail borrowed the money she needed to rent an apartment, and if she couldn't find a place in time, she had plans to stay with a friend in Connecticut. Gail left the salon totally transformed. She had a new haircut and a new lease on life. But that would be the last time Denise would ever see her friend. On the evening of Sunday, July 7th, the day Gail planned to leave Robert, he went to his nephew's birthday party in New Jersey alone. When people asked where Gail was, he said that they had an argument that morning and he was giving her time to cool off. After the party, Robert visited a friend in New Jersey where he explained that Gail stormed out of their house around 11 a.m. and he had not heard from her since. She was wearing shorts, sandals, and a halter top, saying that she was going to go work on her tan in Central Park. While at his friend's place, Robert called his apartment a couple of times, but none of the calls were answered. At this point, Robert began to panic and decided it was time for him to go home. He arrived home around midnight to find the apartment empty. He called one of Gail's friends to ask if she had heard from her, but she hadn't. Robert's worry seems to have lessened because he decided he was going to go to bed and try again in the morning. Gail had a therapy appointment on Monday, July 8th, so the next morning, Robert called her therapist to see if she made it to her appointment, but her therapist said she didn't. Robert tried calling a few other people to see if anyone had spoken to Gail, but no one had seen or heard from her since Saturday. Around 9 p.m. on July 8th, Robert went to the police station and reported his wife missing. Robert told officers that he last saw Gail at 11 a.m. on the day prior when she left their apartment after an argument. He also mentioned that Gail had received a disappointing phone call from someone earlier that morning before their argument, but he didn't provide any other details about the call. At this point, Robert had spoken to a few people about Gail's disappearance, but this time, he claimed Gail was wearing a t-shirt when she left for Central Park, not the halter top he mentioned before. Outside of that detail, his story to police pretty much matched what he told his friends and family. Robert shared with police that his wife was in good physical health but poor mental health, sharing her history of depression and her suicide attempt from 6 years earlier. He also told police they were having weekly marriage counseling sessions. 2 days later, on Wednesday, July 10th, Robert called a detective and asked for a progress report. He also wanted to know if there was anything he could do to help them find Gail. This was odd because another detective on the case had tried calling Robert several times over the last few days, but he hadn't returned those phone calls. On Friday, July 12th, Robert went to the local news to ask the public to report any sightings of Gail. He shared that he believed Gail was the victim of foul play, saying that she would never have abandoned her clients. This was news to the detectives. Robert had indicated to them that Gail might harm herself, but he never told them anything about someone else potentially being involved. Robert's behavior was concerning, and the more the detectives spoke with Gail's loved ones, the more they learned just how concerning Robert's behavior was. On the morning she disappeared, a regular client with her side business, a high-powered attorney named Francesca McCartney, called Gail with a question. Francesca's friend needed surgery and was wondering if Robert had a recommendation for a good doctor. This might be the disappointing phone call that Robert said Gail received that morning because Francesca said Gail sounded really excited when she first called, but after she learned the reason for the call was related to Robert, she seemed down. Francesca also shared with detectives that 2 years earlier, in November 1983, Gail asked to stay in her guest room for a while. When Francesca asked her why, Gail explained she was afraid of Robert and thought he might hurt her. Francesca figured Gail's family would take her in, so she told her she didn't think it was a good idea. After that, things between Francesca and Gail seemed to return to normal. Then, Gail's sister, Gail Katz, brought several concerns forward to detectives. She told police that in August of 1982, about 3 weeks before their wedding, Gail called her sister crying and begged her to come pick her up. When Gail got into Elaine's car, she had her cat with her. Gail explained she caught Robert trying to drown their pet in the toilet. When Gail confronted him about it, he said he was angry and jealous because Gail loved the cat more than him. Robert seemed sorry that he got caught and even implied this wasn't the first time he tried to harm the cat, and it wouldn't be the last. Gail mentioned that Robert had strangled a previous girlfriend's cat. Elaine tried to convince her sister to call off the wedding, but Gail was too embarrassed as invitations had already been sent out. Gail told Elaine she would get rid of the cat and then everything would be fine. Elaine drove Gail to the animal shelter where she surrendered her pet. Then Gail swore Elaine to secrecy. According to the FBI, 75% of abused women who have pets report that their pets are also abused. Victims who report co-occurring animal cruelty are considered to be at an extremely high risk of suffering severe injury or death. Robert and his lawyer have since disputed the story about the cat. Elaine had seen Gail's relationship growing toxic. After they married, Elaine saw Robert take charge of nearly every aspect of Gail's life. He decided what she wore, how she styled her hair, and even urged her to lose weight. Once at a friend's party, Robert forced Gail to sit on his lap for the entire dinner. Elaine recalled a strange double date she went on with Robert and Gail at a sushi restaurant where Robert shoved food into her sister's mouth, then tried to do the same thing with her. They also fought constantly about money, as Robert wanted Gail to contribute more. If the arguments didn't go his way, he threatened to harm himself. Once he grabbed a kitchen knife and threatened to harm himself. On another occasion, he acted like he was going to jump out of their moving car to get away from Gail. Multiple neighbors reported hearing them screaming at each other at all hours. It was a normal occurrence for them. At one point, a neighbor said Gail told him she didn't feel comfortable at home. As a way to escape, Gail began having affairs. It's unclear if Robert knew about these affairs. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Gail had told Elaine and her friends about 2 other men she was seeing. Once she disappeared, Elaine told their parents about the affairs. At this point, Gail's mom was convinced she knew what happened. She left messages on Robert's answering machine saying, quote, "I know you killed my daughter." While investigating the case, detectives found an old police report where Gail accused Robert of assault on November 12, 1983. That day, Gail told a police aide that her husband strangled her to the point at which she lost consciousness. On November 8th, Gail was busy studying for an important test that would determine if she would get into graduate school. Thinking Robert was going to be gone, Gail took a break from her studies. Robert returned home earlier than expected and was immediately enraged to find Gail smoking a cigarette on their balcony. He threw her cigarettes off the balcony, then climbed over the railing and threatened to jump. Gail was able to literally talk him off the ledge, but the argument continued and Robert lunged at Gail and strangled her. The next day, after Gail took her test, she returned to the apartment while Robert was at work. She packed her things and left for her grandfather's house. This was around the time when Gail called Francesca requesting to stay in her guest room. After her report, the police didn't follow up. Instead, the case was referred to family court. Later that month, Gail moved back in with Robert on the condition that he seek counseling. He seemed willing to do whatever it took to save their marriage, and Gail believed he was going to change. She was so confident that she got 2 new cats. After learning about the strangling incident, Robert was brought in for another interview, but this time as a potential suspect. One of the first questions they asked Robert was if he ever strangled Gail. He just said he didn't want to talk about it, though he did admit that he threatened to jump out of a window during an argument, but then said he didn't want to talk about that either. Detectives asked about the claims of animal abuse, and his response was the same. He wasn't going to talk about that. Detectives tried rattling Robert by asking if he knew about the 2 other men Gail was sleeping with, Ken and Anthony. Robert didn't take the bait and simply said he had seen those names in Gail's address book. As the detectives ended the interview, Robert said, quote, "This doesn't look right and people are going to start to wonder." Detectives asked what he meant and Robert responded, "It's obvious, isn't it?" He refused to clarify further, but the implication of his statement was clear. The next day, on July 14th, Robert participated in another interview with police. This one focused on Robert's movements leading up to and right after Gail's disappearance. Robert explained it was a normal weekend. They had dinner and watched a movie on Friday night, went shopping on Saturday before sharing a romantic dinner by candlelight. But on Sunday morning, the argument ensued and Gail disappeared. Robert didn't explain why he didn't look for Gail before leaving at 5:30 for his nephew's party, but his father did confirm that he did arrive at the party at 6:30 p.m. Robert also couldn't explain why he went to work on Monday like everything was normal and why he didn't report his wife missing until that night. Detectives asked for Robert's permission to search his apartment. He didn't agree, but promised he would think about it. Shortly after, he obtained a lawyer. Gail's family figured their best option was to stay as close to Robert as possible and hope he would slip up. Robert knew the Katz family suspected him of murder, but he also knew it wouldn't look good for him if he pushed them away, so he kept them close as well. Gail's family used this as an opportunity to search the apartment for evidence. They found Gail's purse hanging on a door. It contained her credit cards, wallet, and cigarettes. Elaine knew Gail would never leave her cigarettes behind for Robert to find, given his previous outburst. However, there was nothing in the apartment that could be used in the investigation. Meanwhile, the police continued trying to get their own search of the apartment. It would take another 2 months before Robert would give them permission to search his home. His agreement came with very specific conditions from his attorney. Authorities were only allowed to search for things that might help identify Gail if her body was found. Since police didn't have a search warrant, they had to abide by these very specific terms. Inside the apartment, police didn't see any obvious signs that a crime had been committed. Robert's family perpetuated the narrative that Gail had either killed herself or ran away with another man. Meanwhile, Robert started telling different stories to different people. He told a business contact that Gail disappeared because of her relationships with drug dealers. He told one of Gail's friends that she ran off to become a waitress by the beach. He told someone else that he found Gail's towel and suntan lotion in Central Park, though he never relayed that to police. Finally, he told an acquaintance that Gail's therapist warned him that she was suicidal just before her disappearance. Police spoke with her therapist, who denied ever talking to Robert and said that Gail was not suicidal. In October 1985, 4 months after Gail disappeared, Elaine went to Robert's apartment to collect Gail's things. When she showed up, all of Gail's belongings were stuffed into garbage bags, and he had already moved in a new girlfriend, an anesthesiologist named Roberta. Since Gail disappeared, Robert had spent the summer partying in the Hamptons. He had started dating just a couple of weeks after his wife went missing. The first person he started dating was a nurse educator at the hospital where he worked. Roberta was the second person he had dated. A few months after Roberta moved in, the police called Robert in the middle of the night to ask him to identify a woman at a bus terminal who matched Gail's description. According to Roberta, Robert was not excited about this. In fact, he was annoyed and asked if it could wait until the morning. Unfortunately, the woman was not Gail, and police found Robert's behavior odd for someone whose wife was missing. The police would call Robert again in the middle of the night, this time a full year after Gail disappeared. In July of 1986, at 2:30 in the morning, an investigator asked Robert to come to the World Trade Center to identify a woman. Once again, Robert did not seem interested in doing this. That same month, Gail's parents asked the Manhattan District Attorney's Office to take over the investigation. In September 1986, their investigative team began digging into Robert's movements. They looked for Robert's airplane rental history and found a shocking discovery. On July 7, 1985, the day Gail went missing, Robert rented a small plane, a Cessna 172 Skyhawk, from the Caldwell Airport in Fairfield, New Jersey. His flight started at 4:30 p.m. and ended at 6:25 p.m. This proved that Robert had lied to detectives when he told them he was at his apartment until 5:30 p.m. that day, and he couldn't possibly have been at his nephew's party at 6:30 like his father had told the police. Detectives began speaking with Robert's now ex-girlfriend, Roberta, who had become suspicious of Robert after hearing accusatory messages from Gail's family on his answering machine. Roberta told detectives about one of the times Robert was asked to come down in the middle of the night to identify his wife. After he hung up, Roberta felt nervous, thinking Robert's wife was about to come home, and here she was in her bed. But Robert told her she had nothing to worry about because he knew it was not Gail. Roberta immediately clocked what Robert was saying. He knew it wasn't Gail because he knew what happened to her. Roberta shared her theory that Robert used an airplane to dispose of Gail's body in the ocean. One day, when Robert wasn't home, Roberta and a friend checked his handwritten flight log, which showed an altered entry where the log originally showed a flight on July 7, 1985, but it was changed to read August 7, 1985. In February 1987, investigators completed a forensic search of the exact plane Robert had rented, as well as 2 cars he had borrowed the week Gail disappeared. Investigators looked for blood evidence, but found nothing. Investigators had reached a dead end, and in April 1987, 2 years after Gail disappeared, her case officially closed. It remained that way until May 1989, when an unexpected clue washed ashore on Staten Island. A badly decomposed torso with visible surgical cut marks where the arms and legs had been detached matched Gail's size, age, and race. 3 months later, in August 1989, a radiologist determined that it did match previous x-rays of Gail's spine. Her case was reclassified from missing person to homicide. However, the torso didn't provide any useful evidence, and her case remained closed. That fall, Gail's family held a small, private funeral. In late 1989, Robert moved to Las Vegas, where he opened a plastic surgery practice. In 1990, he met 31-year-old chiropractor Stephanie. Once again, Robert seemed like a perfect catch. Stephanie said their first year together was perfect. They went to black tie events, took skiing trips, and volunteered together with an organization that flew doctors to Mexico to treat underprivileged children. But over time, cracks in Robert's facade started to appear. Eventually, he admitted he was married before, but said his wife had disappeared and he didn't like to talk about it. Stephanie shared, quote, "The way he told the story, it was believable. He goes, 'Listen, this isn't for public knowledge. I would really appreciate it if you kept this under wraps.' So, Stephanie did." Robert proposed to Stephanie, but they never got married. By 1993, 3 years after they met, Stephanie learned the truth about Gail's disappearance. Having seen Robert fly into rage on 2 separate occasions, she started to believe Robert was involved in his wife's disappearance. After the second incident involving Robert's explosive rage, Stephanie convinced him they needed to see a therapist. The therapist recommended she end the relationship because her life could be in danger with him. Thankfully, Stephanie listened. Not long after, Robert started dating 36-year-old Carol. She was a divorced mother of 1. Carol opened up to him about her previous marriage, but when she asked if he had ever been married, Robert was reluctant to answer. Carol, unaware of the situation, tried making a joke saying, "What did you do, kill her?" Robert did not take this as a joke and demanded to know what Carol had heard and who told her. Eventually, Carol convinced Robert that she was only joking and she didn't know what he was talking about. Once Robert calmed down, he told Carol that Gail was a depressed drug addict who walked out after an argument and never came home. Initially, Carol believed Robert and thought he deserved his fresh start in Las Vegas. But by the time they broke up, 6 months later, Carol wasn't convinced Robert was innocent. She claimed Robert had threatened to kill her dog during an argument, and once he became enraged at her for breaking a glass while doing the dishes. He even falsely accused her of giving him syphilis. After their breakup in 1996, Carol met Stephanie and another one of Robert's exes, Mindy. The 3 got together and started comparing notes on their ex-boyfriend. Meanwhile, the now 41-year-old had started dating again. He married a Las Vegas gynecologist named Janet. The couple moved to Minot, North Dakota to start a new life. No one in North Dakota knew about Robert's past. In fact, he had become a local hero after he saved a boy who was bitten by a tiger at the North Dakota State Fair. In 1998, the chief investigator with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office assembled a team to reinvestigate Gail's now cold case. While looking into the case, investigators realized Gail's torso was discovered before forensic DNA testing was common, so it was never confirmed to belong to her. With the cat's permission, the torso was exhumed and sent for DNA testing. The torso did not belong to Gail. It actually belonged to Heidi Balch, the first victim of serial killer Joel Rifkin. Her severed head was discovered on a golf course in 1989, the same year her torso was found. Investigators began talking to everyone in Robert's life, including his ex-girlfriends in Las Vegas, who were busy comparing notes. It became apparent that everyone Robert had spoken to over the years had received an incredibly different story about Gail. By now, investigators felt they had enough circumstantial evidence to prosecute Robert. They already had plenty of witnesses willing to testify about his abuse, and in 1999, one final witness sealed his fate. While investigators were working to bring charges against Robert, his and Gail's former psychiatrist came forward wanting to testify. Typically, doctors and therapists can't testify against their patients due to physician-patient privilege, but Dr. Michael Stone hoped the judge would make an exception. After Robert strangled Gail, she insisted that he see a psychiatrist. He chose one, but the doctor found him to be an extremely difficult patient, so he referred Robert and Gail to Dr. Stone. After speaking with his colleague and before meeting with Robert, Dr. Stone believed Robert had a treatable case of borderline personality disorder. However, after meeting with Robert, Dr. Stone realized Robert was actually a dangerous psychopath who was on the verge of hurting Gail. After a few sessions, Dr. Stone even began feeling unsafe around Robert, but he felt that if he rejected Robert, it would end poorly for him, so he devised a plan that would hopefully result in Robert denying treatment. Dr. Stone told Robert he was willing to continue treatment with him on 3 conditions. 1. Dr. Stone would record their sessions and the tape would be mailed to his attorney. 2. Robert would have to pay for a life insurance policy for Dr. Stone that would provide $2 million to each of his sons in the event Robert murdered him. And 3. Gail and Robert had to divorce. As expected, Robert refused these conditions. Dr. Stone felt he had a legal obligation to warn the person he believed his patient intended to harm, so in November 1983, he handed Gail a letter warning her that she needed to leave Robert. The letter read more like a liability notice than a warning, saying, quote, "If I do not heed this advice, I must accept the consequences, including the possibility of personal injury or death at the hands of my husband, and absolve Dr. Stone of responsibility." Gail refused to sign the letter and found herself a new counselor, but she held on to the note with plans to use it as leverage when she demanded a divorce. Gail figured she could send the letter to all of his colleagues, essentially ruining his medical career. Now, with the case open again, Dr. Stone felt he should be allowed to testify. In explaining the note, Dr. Stone said he had never felt the need to write a note like this before and never had since, which showed how serious he believed the situation was. In his interview, Dr. Stone said the reaction Robert had to Gail smoking a cigarette is what freaked him out the most. His explosive rage over small things proved just how volatile and unpredictable he was. On December 9, 1999, the now 44-year-old Robert was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. He was arraigned and then released on the same day on a $500,000 bond. Dr. Stone and 2 other psychiatrists who had warned Gail about Robert testified before a judge. However, when the trial actually began in October 2000, jurors were only allowed to hear third-party testimony about Dr. Stone's letter. The prosecutors brought forward several important factors, including Robert's inconsistent stories and his strange behavior over the years, the fact that he lied about renting an airplane, and the change in his flight log. They theorized that Robert had dismembered Gail's body, placed it in a flight bag, then flew over the Atlantic Ocean where he pushed the bag out of the plane. To prove this theory, they had a pilot recreate the crime using an actual Cessna plane. The pilot was able to leave the controls unattended briefly without any danger as he pushed a flight bag stuffed with 120 pounds of sand out of the plane. The defense, on the other hand, tried to paint Gail as an unstable woman with mental health issues and a drug problem. They presented one witness, a man, who said he saw Gail on the afternoon she disappeared. He described seeing her at a bagel shop with another woman. She was wearing pink shorts and a t-shirt, matching Robert's description of what Gail was wearing when she disappeared. Then they floated the theory that one of Gail's affair partners had killed her, though they had no evidence of this. Throughout their presentation, all the defense could do was remind the jury that there was no body and no forensic evidence. They hoped this would create enough reasonable doubt for the jurors. However, it did not. After 5.5 hours of deliberation, on October 24, 2000, Robert was found guilty of second-degree murder. His wife Janet was in the courtroom but stepped out when the verdict was read. She was there again on November 29th for Robert's sentencing hearing, holding out on the belief that Robert was innocent. Robert was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He made attempts over the years to have his conviction overturned, but they were unsuccessful. For decades, Robert continued to maintain his innocence, but in December 2020, he stood before a parole board and, for the first time, confessed to killing his wife. Robert told the board, quote, "I wanted her to stop yelling at me, and I attacked her." When asked how he attacked his wife, he explained that he had strangled her. He continued saying, quote, "I went flying, I opened the door, and then I took her body out of the airplane over the ocean." He also told the board he killed his wife because he was immature and didn't understand how to deal with his anger. His admission shocked everyone because it was the exact theory prosecutors had presented in court 20 years earlier. At the time of this recording, 71-year-old Robert remains incarcerated in the Otisville Correctional Facility in New York. His next parole hearing is scheduled for June 2028. In honor of her sister, Elaine said the nonprofit organization Pace Women's Justice Center was rebranded as Gail's House to bring greater awareness to domestic violence issues and provide resources to women. Elaine allowed them to use her sister's name as a way to honor her memory and to give her sister a resting place. Thank you for listening to Without a Trace. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into Gail's disappearance. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and follow Without a Trace on social media, and join me next week as I dive into another case.